In 1980, a book hit shelves that terrified millions. It wasn't a horror novel, and it wasn't fiction. It was marked as truth. The name of this book was called Michelle Remembers. And inside its pages, a woman described memories of her childhood. Memories that she said had been sealed away for decades. Memories of being taken into a basement by her own mother, surrounded by adults in robes, and forced to watch rituals that twisted faith into something dark. Just a few things that she saw. One, she saw snakes crawl over her body, and she said she actually saw Satan himself. And then she said the Virgin Mary appeared to save her. Now, you had some that called her brave, and of course others called her delusional. But the impact of her story, that part is undeniable. Tonight, we're going deep into the world of that book called Michelle Remembers. Because whether you believe it or not, this book changed the world. Welcome back, listeners and watchers, to another dark and very, very disturbing episode of Relative Perspective. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and tonight we're digging into one of the most infamous books of the 20th century, again called Michelle Remembers. Now, here's the thing. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, and I'm not here to fact check every single line. What I want to do tonight is tell Michelle's story the way that she told it. And then I'm going to bring in a few voices that claim that they went through the same thing that Michelle went through herself. Because here's the question that kept a lot of people awake at night. If Michelle said that she remembers this, and then other people started saying that they remember too, then maybe it wasn't just her, and maybe it was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. So I want you to sit back, dim the lights, and let's go back to where it all started, inside a therapist's office with one woman, a tape recorder, and her memories. Okay, Michelle Smith was in her 20s when she sat down with Dr. Lawrence Pazder in Victoria, British Columbia. Now, at first, the sessions were ordinary, but in 1976, something broke through. Now, one day, Michelle let out a 25-minute scream nonstop, and then began speaking in the voice of a 5-year-old child. From there, Dr. Pazder said that the next 600 hours, over more than a year, uncovered something darker than either of them expected. Michelle insisted that these were not dreams. She swore up and down that these were memories sealed away since childhood. Memories of when she was just a 5-year-old little girl around 1955. She claimed that her own mother brought her into a dark basement filled with people in black robes. She said that there were candles arranged in circles, stone floors. The walls were covered like with these black sheets. And not only that, she noticed all the people were kind of dancing around. You know, she's never seen them dancing like this. And they were speaking in languages that she'd never heard. The one main thing that she said that they always wanted her to do was watch, always watch, as acts of cruelty unfolded right there in front of her little eyes. One thing that she described was they made her lay down while they put snakes, and the snakes slithered all over her little body. And basically, this was just a test of her obedience to see if she'd stay still and do what they told her to do. Also, she said that they would lock her in dark cages hours on end. But she was always brought back to witness sacrifices, animal and human. Michelle said that these ceremonies, they weren't random. They were deliberate parodies of Catholic rituals. She said there were prayers spoken backwards, crosses turned upside down, and holy days twisted in grotesque performances. And then she said that there were moments, and a lot of them, that went beyond the human. She told Pazder that she saw demons in fire and smoke, looking at her and smiling from a distance. She even said during one of the main rituals closer to the end that she actually saw Satan himself. The part that made even seasoned listeners pause was this. Michelle said that sometimes she came away from these ceremonies with like cuts, bruises, and scars. And before the end of some of these rituals, those scars, bruises, and cuts would heal right there in front of the group, as if the pain itself, it never happened. And at the height of it all, she also said that the Virgin Mary appeared to her. She described being comforted, healed, and told that her memories would be sealed away until she was old enough or strong enough to handle them. She claimed that this ordeal ended in an 81-day ritual broken only by divine intervention. I want you to think about that for a second. You got a 5-year-old girl claiming that she had snakes crawl all over her body. She had scars disappearing, and she claimed to see Satan himself standing in that same room, right up until the Virgin Mary intervened. Whether you believe her or not, those memories are the same memories that shaped her entire life, and eventually would shape the fears of an entire generation. Now, I don't want you to take these stories from me. I want you to be able to hear it from her own mouth. Why don't you go ahead and take a listen?
Basically, what I remembered was a 14-month period of my life at age 5, where I was given to a group of people whom at first I wasn't aware of what they were doing, other than to a child. They were adults doing things I couldn't understand and that frightened me. About 3.5 months into the remembering, I realized through the ritual and repetition that these people had that they were involved in some type of satanic church or worship.
You were then how old?
5 years old. The first thing I remembered was a night when a group of people were gathered to do, I didn't know what. They were doing dances that were not like the dances I was used to. They had the walls draped in black. They had set up candles, that kind of thing. And basically what I remembered is quite a struggle that very early got set up between myself and them, in that they somehow wanted me to participate in something that I as a child couldn't comprehend.
Did you have a mother and father?
Yes.
There?
Yes. No, my mother was present, but not in the ceremony, not in the ritual. She wasn't involved in that. Her position seemed to be one of giving me to this group. They were certainly dedicated to doing a lot of seriously frightening and destructive things.
Were you molested or injured or tortured in some way?
Yes, I was physically hurt a lot. At one point, because of the lack of cooperation that I exhibited, they placed me in a car and literally drove it over the side of a cliff with me in it. I survived that car accident.
How old were you then?
I was 5 years old.
And what do you think was the end result of these ceremonial tortures that you went through?
I think basically they somehow wanted me to become a part of whatever it was they were involved in. They somehow wanted me to be taken over by their belief system.
Did you recall anything about animal or human sacrifices?
They sacrificed animals, and they used fetuses of babies in their ceremonies.
An animal was sacrificed in front of you?
They would sacrifice kittens and things like that.
And smear you with
that.
The body.
But to a small child, you see, in order to survive that, you said at one point that would drive people crazy. But a small child, the kinds of things that they do in a situation like that is, for instance, they put me in a cage at one point. Instead of seeing that as a place that trapped me, I saw it as a place that protected me from these people I was afraid of. And inside that little space, I could create my own world.
Who were these people?
Well, they're a secret organization, they're a secret society. A secret society does not reveal the identity of the people or the ways of their practices. I was familiar with this type of society firsthand in Africa, practicing general medicine there. And if one of the members of that society revealed who he was killed instantly. This is the story of a child holding on to what she believed was good inside herself, her innocence. And through that was able to stand up against all that these people could do, and through spiritual interventions was able to as well.
What?
At one point in this experience, they had become very serious in their spiritual invocation of things, and at one point I was literally being frightened to death. At that moment, when I think I was dying, a very soft white light came and enveloped me, much like the feeling of being padded with cotton batton, and out of that a woman came and stood beside me and took a hold of my hand, identified herself as ma mère, and basically told me to hang on, to help me understand the situation I was in and how to get through it.
Ma mère?
Ma mère.
The Virgin Mary?
That's right. I didn't know who that was at 5. All I knew was this was the first person that had come along in 10 months of my life who cared about me as a person and who wanted me to survive, not to destroy me.
Michelle, why did you write the book?
That was a question I wrestled with for about 2 months. Do I just sit back in Victoria with what I know which would have been the easier for me as a person. But with the responsibility of the kind of information that I had out of this experience, I knew that it needed to be shared, and then I had to decide, do I share it just with religion or do I share it just with psychiatry? But those areas are studying it anyway. It's the average person that with this kind of information, as Dr. Pazder said, to me, whether anybody believes it isn't what's important. To me, the importance is in sharing the information so that maybe we can make some wiser decisions about the kinds of things that go on. Maybe we won't get so easily pulled into cults. Maybe we won't dismiss a child brought into an emergency ward with the kinds of abuse that I suffered. Maybe we won't just dismiss that as a child abuse case, that we'll see them at the hands of these people. But more than that, I made a promise to this person who came, Mama Mare, that I would share this with as many people as I could.
The Virgin Mary.
So I'm keeping a childhood promise.
Now, the main person that believed her was her doctor. Again, his name is Dr. Pazder. He recorded her sessions. He transcribed the words. He consulted clergy. And get this, they even gained an audience with the Pope. And after it was all said and done, in 1980, he and Michelle went ahead and published that book, again called Michelle Remembers. This thing was sold as truth, and for millions of readers, this became proof that the devil was closer than anybody wanted to imagine. Here's what's crazy. Michelle, she wasn't actually the only one. Once that book hit shelves in 1980, more and more people began saying those same words that they remember too. And what they described, though the names and places were completely different, often lined up with Michelle's memories in disturbing ways. Our first story, it happened in 1983. A mother by the name of Judy Johnson accused staff at a preschool in California of abusing her son. The case actually exploded into one of the longest and most expensive trials in U.S. history. You had dozens of children that came forward. They claimed that they had been taken out of the school, taken into underground tunnels, and into secret rooms. And once they got them there, all these kids said that they were made to participate in strange rituals. They spoke of robes, chanting, and get this, even animals and small babies were harmed during these ceremonies. Now, I want you to think about that. You have preschoolers. These kids were barely old enough to tie their own shoes. All the while, they were describing secret rooms, rituals, and robed adults. Now, whether or not the evidence held up in court, the fear that those words carried was real as hell. And around the same time in Kern County, California, you had two young girls by the name of Mary and Kathy Keller. And again, they told authorities that they had been abused by family members as part of a satanic ritual. Now, once everything got going, the accusations, they snowballed, and dozens of people were arrested. This is almost like a broken record. The children described being taken to these dark rooms, witnessing strange ceremonies, and being forced to watch things that no children should ever see. Now, I want you to understand, many of the convictions that followed were all later overturned. The courts ruled that most of the investigators had used coercive and leading questioning, but the accounts themselves, they left deep scars, both for the accused and for the children that told their stories. Then came Paul Ingram in the late 1980s. This dude, he wasn't a child. He was a sheriff's deputy in Washington State, and his daughters accused him of abuse tied to ritual ceremonies. At first, Ingram said that he couldn't remember a thing, but after hours of questioning and prayer sessions, that's when he began to recover some of those memories. He confessed to elaborate rituals, all with robes, chants, and sacrifices. And these memories, they grew darker each time he was pressed. Of course, experts later argued that all those confessions were a product of suggestion. But all in all, the case became a symbol of just how deeply the panic had seeped in. What's crazy about this is even a man of authority could be made to remember. Okay, by the mid-'80s, the survivor accounts all over the country began to sound eerily similar. You had candles and robes, masks and chanting, underground rooms, and that repeat theme of children being forced to watch. And to me, that's the part that sticks with you. Because whether the courts proved it or not, whether every detail was reliable or not, the stories, they kept coming. Michelle had given the world a vocabulary. And once that vocabulary was out there, more and more people began to speak up. By the late 80s, the fear had escaped the courtroom. The phrase satanic ritual abuse wasn't just headlines anymore. It actually became part of everyday conversation. You had parents whispering it at playgrounds, you had pastors that preached it in the pulpit, and you had news anchors leaning across their desk and warning you that this could happen in your town. And once that fear took root, it didn't need proof anymore. It just needed repetition. And of course, all the daytime talk shows, they jumped right in the mix. You had Oprah Winfrey, Geraldo Rivera, 2020. It seemed like every week there was a new special on one of these shows. You had Geraldo Rivera, like I mentioned earlier. He actually came out with a primetime documentary called Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground. Now, this thing pulled in nearly 20 million views. And the show claimed that there was more than 1 million practicing Satanists all across our country. Now, I want you to think about that. 1 million. That's not just a few scattered cults, and it's definitely not a handful of disturbed loners. To me, that's a hidden army. They didn't have any evidence to back this up, but evidence wasn't required. All they had to do was say it, and people believed it. And here's the thing. Once the media says something often enough, people usually begin to believe it, kind of like what's going on today. And next, you had evangelical preachers all across the country that took Michelle's story as proof that we were in some kind of a spiritual war. Sunday sermons, all of a sudden, they turned into warnings. And you had Christian bookstores all over the nation that was filled with books on how to basically battle this evil stuff that's going on. Now, I think this is kind of far-fetched, but they even had books that told parents that He-Man and the Smurfs and even My Little Pony were tools of Satan. They made it to where Halloween, which was called Satan's holiday. Then you had rock music, which was Satan's hymnals. And I'm sure you remember this game, Dungeons and Dragons. Some parents considered that Satan's training manual. Almost anything a kid could enjoy was suddenly a trap. Now, I don't have to do this because I was a teenager in the 1980s, but I do kind of remember this. People put on that heavy metal music, and some people would look at them like they were actually lighting candles for Satan. Now, law enforcement actually got swept into this panic too. They began training recruits in police academies on how to spot satanic crimes. And then they started out handing different types of manuals and pamphlets that had lists of supposed red flags. Some of the things that were in these manuals were like if they saw pentagrams, candles, people dressed in black clothing, animal bones on the ground. Even mood swings in teenagers were considered a possible indicator. Now, the FBI finally swooped in and they eventually did their own review back in the 1990s. And they basically admitted that there was no evidence of organized satanic cults. But by then, it didn't matter. For almost a decade, cops in small towns were convinced that they were chasing after the devil's army. For ordinary families, the fear changed daily life. The parents would actually sit down and grill their kids after school and ask them questions like, did your teacher say anything weird today? Or did they touch you in a bad spot? Or did you even see candles floating around? You had daycares that closed all over the country, babysitters were accused, and families were torn apart. Even neighbors, they looked at each other differently. Now, this is the danger with panic. Once it catches fire, it doesn't burn clean. It scorches everything that it touches. It burns the guilty, the innocent, and everybody in between. And remember, it all started with that one story. That story gave the world a script. And once that script existed, everyone else had their role to play. Survivors used it to describe their memories. Police used it to frame their investigations. Preachers used it to fill their pulpits. And TV producers used it to, of course, boost their ratings. Proof it didn't matter anymore. Belief was all they needed. And to me, that's the scary part, because you don't need an army of demons to change a culture. All you need is just that one story that's scary enough to make people think that evil is around every corner. Now, for all the darkness in that book Michelle remembers, there's also another side. And this is the part that Michelle clung to the most. She didn't just describe snakes, demons, and sacrifices. She also described something where something holy broke through that evil room. Michelle said that during some of the longest, most brutal ceremonies, she suddenly felt a different kind of presence. Surprisingly, she said it was warm, comforting, and protective. In her own words, she claimed that she saw the Virgin Mary. She claimed that Mary appeared to her again and again, shielding her from harm, healing the scars on her skin, and promising Michelle that she would not die during these rituals. Michelle believed that Mary, along with Jesus and the archangel Michael, intervened to protect her. In her telling, it all came to a climax in one of the final rituals. And this one was a doozy. It was an 81-day-long ritual meant to summon Satan himself. Michelle said that she was there, that she actually saw the devil summoned, and she said that the ritual was supposed to end in her death. But instead, she said that she saw the Virgin Mary appear, she banished Satan, and she sealed Michelle's memories until she was strong enough to remember them. Now, I want you to think about that. You had a 5-year-old girl that was surrounded by everything evil that she could imagine. And what she remembers the most, it's not just the terror, it's the divine rescue. Now, to me, that's powerful, because whether you believe the memories literally happened or not, that theme of hope in the dark is something that all survivors hold on to. Now, I want you to understand something. When that book came out, the majority of the readers, they focused on the evil. And that's very understandable. They looked at the rituals, the demons, and the panic. But Michelle, she always said that the heart of her story, it wasn't about the evil, it was about her survival. She always believed that God intervened and that he saved her for a reason. And that by remembering and speaking about everything that happened, she was fulfilling that reason. And that's why her story resonated so deeply in all those churches. Pastors, they didn't just point at that book as the proof of Satan. They also pointed to it as proof of God's power. They felt that that was proof that the devil could try, but in the end, heaven would always win. And for Michelle, faith, it wasn't just a religion. It was literally the rope that pulled her out of that pit. And she sincerely believed that she's alive because she was protected by that divine power. And she's not the only one that says that, because that thread is something that you hear from a lot of survivors too. You had some that described moments where they felt the presence that was shielding them, or a sudden light in a dark room, or they swear that they heard a voice that told them to hold on. And that's something that I'd like you to sit with for a second, because I understand it's easy to get lost in that fear with the demons and the cults and all that panic. But for all the people that say that they lived through this, hope, it wasn't abstract. It was real. And it was the reason they all survived. Now, at the end of her book, Michelle made it clear. She wasn't trying to just tell a horror story. She was doing her best to bear witness. She wanted people to know that even in the worst kind of evil, there can still be redemption. And who knows, maybe that's why her story lasted as long as it did. Not just because it terrified people, but maybe because it reminded them that darkness, it doesn't always get the last word. Okay, now I want you to understand something. Michelle herself, she leaned into this story. She never backed down from those memories. Even as critics, they tried to poke holes in timelines or logistics, she stood firm. She swears that this happened, and she swears that she lived it. And for many of these survivors, Michelle's book was the first time that they realized that they weren't really alone. It gave them a language to say that this happened to me too. You had a lot of adults later on in life that said after reading Michelle's books, it actually broke some of the memories that they had from their childhood. And a lot of them said that her book gave them courage to speak out, even when people didn't believe them. Now, for the children who testified all those years ago, many were dismissed once all that panic cooled. You had courts that threw out convictions, and of course, reporters moved on like they always do. And skeptics, they do what they do, and they call it hysteria. But those kids and those later on those adults that said that this happened to them, they still hold on to those memories. Some recanted under pressure, and others, they stuck to their stories. And some, well, some, they just stayed silent because they didn't want to be picked on or laughed at. And in my opinion, that's part of the tragedy here. Because if you choose to believe Michelle and those children, then what we call satanic panic, it wasn't hysteria at all. It was a mass outcry from victims that got swallowed up by doubt, bureaucracy, and the need to move on. And decades later, we're still stuck between two versions of history. You had one side that said that the whole thing was mass hysteria, and on the other side, you had the story where Michelle and all those children were telling the truth. And right in the middle of that gap is where the unease lives. Because I want you to understand something. If those survivors are right, then the darkness that they described never vanished when the panic did. It's still here. Even now, decades later, you still have people stepping forward. They sit in therapy rooms, they write on online forums, they speak quietly in support groups, and when all of them tell their story, it all sounds hauntingly familiar. Now, some of the survivors, they swear that they'd never even heard of Michelle's book until years later. And yet, when the memories surfaced, the same elements were there. They had candles and circles, adults in robes and masks, basements or hidden rooms, chants and rituals that mocked religion, and most of all, being forced to watch. They all described the same twisted holidays, the same dark shadows in the room, and the same sense that something darker than human was always present. Now, like always, you're going to have skeptics that say that all these stories echo each other because they're part of the same script. But here's the other side of that coin. What if the script was always there, hidden in their memory, and Michelle's book finally gave people permission to speak it out loud? Now, I want you to understand something about these survivors. It wasn't just what they went through when they were kids. Speaking up came with a price too. Some lost their families when they told the truth, and others were told to stop lying and to stop trying to seek attention. And many, they carried their memories in silence for fear that they'd be called crazy or that they were just trying to jump on the panic bandwagon. And yet, they still have the strength to move forward quietly and carefully, but with conviction. And the hardest part for these survivors, it isn't always the memories. It's actually the silence that surrounds them. Now, you have to understand that silence was drilled into them as children. And breaking that silence, it feels like breaking the rules of survival. That's why for these survivors, finding just one person that listens, just one person, can actually be life-saving. So I have to ask you, what do you think we do with all this? You have Michelle's memories, the children's testimonies, the panic that swept the world, and the survivors that still whisper to this day. What does it all add up to? One way to see it is as a question of memory. Skeptics argue that the human brain, it's suggestible, that hypnosis, it can plant memories in your head just as easily as it can find them. Maybe Michelle's visions were created in that therapy chair, I don't know. But if that's true, how do we explain the consistency? How do we explain that over and over in places that's far away from each other, you have people that describe the same candles, the same robes, and the same rituals? To me, it's not enough to shrug off as coincidence, because the echoes are way too loud and the patterns are too sharp. Even if memory can be influenced, why do so many people see the same things? And another way to look at it is through a spiritual lens. Michelle, she didn't tell her story just to shock us. She told it as a testimony. She wanted us to understand that evil is real, but so is God's power. Her book, it doesn't end in despair, but in intervention. You have the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and the Archangel Michael stepping in to save this child's life. And for many readers, including myself, that was the most important part. It wasn't just that Satan was in that basement, it's that heaven showed up too. And then there's the broader meaning. That book, it didn't just spark a panic. It actually exposed a wound in society. It showed how quickly that we can be consumed by fear. It showed how ready we are to see evil behind every corner, and how dangerous that can be when it leads to false accusations. But it also forced us to admit something darker, that maybe all that fear, it stuck because it touched a nerve. Because maybe deep down, we know that some children are hurt more than we care to admit. And sometimes the monsters, there aren't always in stories and movies. So here we are, decades later, still haunted by Michelle's words. And I'm sure we're still debating what was real and what was hysteria. And I hope you realize something. The truth, it may never be nailed down, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that evil, it doesn't always leave fingerprints. Sometimes it leaves stories, sometimes it leaves scars, and sometimes it leaves a silence that survivors spend their whole life trying to break. And out of all those stories, even if one of those survivor stories was real, if even one child really did see what Michelle described, then that darkness, it's not a myth, it's history. Now, like I said in the beginning, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. You do your own research, you find your own answers. That's the only honest way through something like this. But before we sign off, I want to ask you something, and this is a big one. It's a big what if. What if the people that were involved with all these rituals are the same ones that had the power to say that Michelle, along with all of the other children that came out, were the ones that had the power to convince the world that they were all lying? What if the people behind all those robes and masks were the same ones that said these stories are debunked? What if they were the same ones that convinced the world that all these children were just imagining things? Because when you admit the possibility that power, evil power, can hide in plain sight, you stop letting simple answers comfort you. Now I want you to think about power and think about institutions and think about who benefits when voices, certain voices, are silenced. Who gets to write the record? Who gets to call something hysteria and move on? And who loses when headlines stop caring? If the survivors were telling the truth, and the people who needed to keep it quiet were the very ones able to shape the narrative, then all that debunking, it's not the end of this story. It's an extra chapter in harm. It's a cover, and it's the wrong hand turning out the lights. And if you're the kind of person who needs neat finish lines, this one's going to be hard for you to take. There are no tidy endings here. There are only stories and echoes, and those poor people who've been carrying these stories for decades. So you ask, what do you do with that, right? Well, you don't try to swallow it whole. You don't become paranoid about every neighbor. What you do is you stay curious and you investigate. You do your best to listen when someone tells you something that doesn't quite line up with the narrative that everybody else is pushing. You push for the truth, and you try to ask the hard questions. You give survivors space to tell their stories without weaponizing it. And the one big thing that you need to remember is that institutions tend to always protect themselves first. Now, again, if Michelle was right, there are horrors that we still don't understand. And if she was wrong, if she was lying about everything, then this episode, it still forced us to reckon how badly some children are treated, how memory works, and how power, no matter what side it's on, is able to shape the truth. Either way, silence is not an option. Okay, here's the last thing that I want to leave you here with tonight. Whether you think Michelle was telling the whole truth, part of the truth, or maybe she was misunderstanding her past, the real test is how we treat people when they claim that they've been hurt. Do we rush to exonerate, or do we sit and listen and try to help? Because if even one of those voices was right, someone needs us to stop pretending that we figured it all out. Okay, guys, I want to thank you for riding with me tonight in this deep and dark and very, very difficult story. Now, I decided not to do a paranormal confession tonight because honestly, I felt like this was one big, huge paranormal confession, and I didn't want to overload you guys. And with that being said, if you've got a story of your own that you'd like to share, something you've seen, something you've lived through, or something that you just can't explain, all you got to do is hit me up at relativeperspective76@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your story, and who knows, maybe I will be able to highlight it in a future episode. And if you like tonight's deep dive, I want you to go ahead and do the triple threat. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button, pound down on that like button, hit the notification bell so you don't miss a weekly upload, and share this with someone who loves these kind of stories. Again, I want to thank you for sticking around with me for this long. You've been listening to Relative Perspective. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and until next time, God bless you, we love you, and good night. Whew, man, I need to say a prayer. This was dark. God bless you. Thank you.